Our keynote this morning is Michael Keara, user advocate, and he will be talking about a blank screen. Anyway, without further ado, I'll let you do your introduction and everything else. So give it up for Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. You're very, very accurate in terms of what the subject of the talk is today. Uncanny, actually. Thanks, Chris, for inviting me to be here. I don't know if he was just in a drunken stupor at the time, but it was at last Doug T.O. pub night. He said, "Do you want to do the keynote?" So I said, all right. But thank you for coming out on Sunday, on a lovely Sunday, the one weekend that is not raining. Really appreciate you being here. So Chris made the mistake of saying you don't have to talk about Drupal. You can talk about whatever you want, Michael. So I'm going to take him up on that. But I want to get Drupal in there. I'm going to put Drupal in a large context, hence the slide. But I'm going to start with going through a number of sort of concepts, which they're sort of, in a sense, conceptual tools that I've been using over the past, throughout my career. And they work well for me. I just wanted to share them with you. And I want to sort of go into some of where it's all coming from, because what I do as a user advocate is I try to put a context around technology. My kind of slogan is that all functionality outside of a usage context is meaningless. And I absolutely mean that. So for me, it's very important to put things into context. So my background originally was fine arts. And when I went to London National Gallery, London National Gallery as a teenager, I saw this painting, Madonna of the Rocks by Leonardo, and I was really blown away by it because of the amount of detail, the amount of sort of insight that was captured in a painting like this. The painting is still there, but it's hidden behind bulletproof glass. You can't actually see it now, but at the time it was just sort of there raw, and you could really see what was going on. It influenced me a lot. Excuse me. So I decided, being an impressionable teenager, well, I'm going to try something like that. So I decided to do a painting like the Madonna of the Rocks. And the first thing I thought was, well, it has to be big. So I got myself a big canvas. And then it has to have mountains. It has to have a woman in it. In a sense, it was an impossible task at the time because I didn't have a strategy to finish it. I had a big canvas. I managed to get some mountains in there, and I ended up actually just leaving a big hole in the middle where the woman was supposed to be. I hadn't really figured out how to actually do that bit. Well, it's now two paintings. I decided to cut them up because of the big hole. But it ended up being very much about the trees. I spent a lot of time just sort of contemplating the tree and just working on that. So in other words, I was working with the wrong tools. I was working with small brush and no strategy. So that's what happens. Yeah. From a long time ago. So what I expected, because the project was to do a large canvas, I thought it was just a matter of time. So what I did was I took it off to university first year, and I thought I would just finish it there because I was in art school. And that didn't happen. The professors didn't exactly laugh at me, but they did point out that this was the 20th century, and this was actually not what we do these days. So they kind of influenced me to an extent, tried to get me to think about abstract expressionism. At which point I thought, why? Why should I do any of that? So what I did was I became obsessed with sort of questioning all of it. I had one professor, Trevor Hodgson, who was very influential, and he said something that was actually kind of magic for me at the time. He said, get rid of your preconceived ideas. I don't think it was particularly saying I shouldn't be doing this, but with any kind of work with fine arts, that was his strategy. Get rid of preconceived ideas, and that turned out to be a really good idea. So what I did, I took that literally. So then I started to ask questions about what art was, and for whatever reason, I'm not entirely sure why, but I decided I wanted to get it reduced down to a formula. At the time, I was beginning to get very interested in technology. I was very impressed by what was going on with technology at the time. It was before computers were really sort of common or popular. And I was impressed by the fact that that things could be expressed in simple terms like that. So I came up with a formula for art that I have been using ever since. So I just want to share that. It's one of my conceptual tools I want to share with you now. Basically, it gets down to this, 2 words, minimal redundancy. So I'm not going to go into that into detail, but it does actually work. If you think about it in terms of form and content, minimal redundancy describes a kind of a balance between that, where nothing is extra and nothing is left out. So then I went on thinking, well, what else can I, reduce to some kind of formula? And again, so I read somewhere that meaning could not be described, could not be defined. So I took that as a challenge. I thought, well, maybe I could actually come up with something, a formula for meaning, which I did, and I've been using that ever since. I got more and more into technology, into computer graphics and so on, away from the paint and more into the ones and zeros. That led to a career in software development. I spent some time at Corel doing work on CorelDRAW there and other things. Then I got into other kinds of usability stuff. Now I run a small company called the User Advocate Group. And what we have for a slogan there is making usable websites, making websites usable. And what I'd like to do is show in this presentation how usable and meaningful are pretty much equivalent. So when it comes to applications, that's what usable really means. That's what meaning really means as well. So we'll get into that. So I want to start by talking about nothing. This is representing the number 0. The number 0 is really interesting because it's actually also a piece of technology. It had to be invented. It was invented somewhere, I think, well, actually it was invented in 3 separate places, somewhere around year 500, or from 100 BC to 500 AD. And it was a piece of technology that was needed, obviously, to get to where we are today. But the early adopters had a hard time selling it because people couldn't understand the idea of 0. Because, as the explanation goes, if Johnny has an apple, and then Johnny gives that apple to Billy, Johnny has 0 apples. But the realists and the critics at the time would say, but the apple's over there. And they couldn't understand the concept of 0 apples. It's also a term which, a concept, I think, which is really valuable from the point of, say, art. As I said, that one magic phrase was get rid of preconceived ideas, which is basically the idea of emptying out. So I like 0 because it is about emptiness, and that is a really, really key concept, I think, to any kind of creative activity. You have to get rid of your preconceived ideas.
What would you envisage the use case for 0 being when they were first pitching it?
I don't know.
When somebody comes along and says, I have this great concept, 0, and then, Johnny gives away his apple and has 0 apples, well, who cares? Johnny?
I think it's a really good idea. It's a really good question. Yeah, it's a really good question. I have no idea. But maybe we can talk about that more afterwards. We'll see where that goes. The other thing which is really a useful thing is something. The notion of 1 is obviously very important. But again, there's different kinds of meanings to that. For example, it's about unity. It's a unit. The concept that there is oneness. In developer terms, Boolean logic, it means truth. There's a really wonderful saying by the Buddha, which is truth is 1. There is no second. I kind of bend that a little bit. I like to say there's only 1. There is no second. The idea that there is just 1, it's like the grand singleton, I think is a really interesting concept, and I like to play with that idea. I'll show you how. If you take these 2 things together, the 0 and the 1, and you put them into a dance as symbols, you come up with a form of eternity, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And it's a quandary for designers. It's a quandary for us as website builders and so on when we want to avoid this kind of eternity. There's also another way to look at eternity in terms of how the something occupies the space of nothing. So how does something occupy space? This is a drawing by my daughter, Simone. And it's a tree. So the idea that it can go from oneness here into some kind of infinite space, I find fascinating because of the shape. And the shape is unique, and it gives it what I would say is an identity. So in terms of oneness, you can apply that concept recursively, the oneness of this branch, the oneness of this sub-branch, and so on. And it's an interesting sort of way of looking at how everything does fuse into one. There's also the hidden part of a tree. It is the part that we don't usually see, but it's also there. So this shape of a tree I find really a useful symbol for the concept of identity, just because of the uniqueness of each tree in terms of shape. Now I boiled that down to a small symbol for tree, which I use in some of the work that I do. And it's about basically the relationship to boundaries as well as shape. So there's shape in terms of the extent, but there's also this boundary aspect and different relationships to that boundary within and without. And that is a very important concept when it comes to the idea of growth. So speaking of boundaries, here's another boundary where it's another emptiness. So this emptiness is defined, is suggested to us by the limits of this, what we call an object. And here's another one. The shape is different. So again, emptiness, I think, has more meanings to it than just simply absolutely nothing. So we can use it in sort of practical ways, I think. But of course, it does suggest the question of what to do with emptinesses like this. And that's the one that we're often confronted with. What should I put here? And that's much of what we do as website builders. And what we decide in the end that needs to go there is content. And that's become a really hot topic these days for this reason. Most people can think of something like this, a bowl of Cheerios, for example, more easily. They can think of an empty bowl. This is something that they can resolve and they can understand more readily than the empty bowl, which they often don't spend time looking at. But if you take the same contents, for example, of this one, and put it into a different emptiness, you can run into a different kind of scenario. And that, I think, pretty much summarizes what's going on with mobile these days. And that's why it's become a hot topic. Now we have different emptinesses, and we have the problem of dealing with that content going into these multiple kinds of spaces. Karen McGrain, who did the keynote at Drupalcamp in Portland, spoke about this marvelously. Her book, Content Strategy for Mobile, is really worth reading. She really goes into the roots of this problem and has some amazing ideas about what to do with it. So really, in this quote, she's really saying it's about content strategy. So what I like is the fact that content strategies have come to the foreground of the discussion, of the debate about what to do with the web. We're not stuck with pixels and browser wars and so on. We're now at the point where it's about content, and I think that's a good place to be. Sarah Walker-Butcher also has a book. These books both came out last year, Content Everywhere, and she's talking about the fact that you can't assume that the content is going to be sitting in your desktop browser anymore, the same thing that we've been talking about, but you actually don't know where it's going to go. So she doesn't like the history. I mean, she points out that the fact that the history of pages gives us a problem. It's an anchor, a conceptual anchor that we have to overcome. She also says that content is not just about being flexible into these different forms, it's about being meaningful. So the concept of meaning has actually come to the foreground as well, which is why I'm doing this talk, because I think we should understand what meaning is. And she also talks about this, I like this last part, she talks about the content itself being mobile, not just the fact that the users are mobile and the forms are mobile, but the content itself is mobile because you don't know which emptiness it's going to go into. So she talks about it traveling into the unknown, which I think is quite poetic. So anyway, what about our luggage? What about pages? Well, that's become actually a hot topic, obviously. We had this wonderful debate about it at ABOF at DrupalCon Denver last year, which I led with Yoroi. And it was very productive because we went around the table and we asked everybody what they thought a web page was, and we notated it's on this, this page on Drupal.org. And that, for me, led to a lot of thinking and, sort of processing that concept and this series of ideas that I'm going into now. But there's the luggage, the handwritten, hand-drawn object, which was the early book. And obviously, information didn't move very far. It wasn't very mobile at the time. These things were very heavy. You didn't want to be traveling around with it in your pocket. It was basically too big for that. Around 1450, Gutenberg invented the movable type press, and that changed everything. It changed everything about our society, because now information and content begins to become mobile, because it could be reproduced at an inexpensive or relatively expensive way. And then, of course, interesting things happen. So now the content changes. So now, coincidentally or not, the content of this book, for example, is Galileo, it's science. So science gets a really strong foothold around this very same time. I don't think that's a coincidence. So who is actually now minding the shop when it comes to information? Not the same people it was. It's now out, it's released. So the objects themselves still draw a fascination. The books, as books, for many people have very special properties. Of course, that's being changed these days. But when I was doing the slide preparation for this talk, I came across this book. He asked the same question we were asking in Denver, except he's talking about the book, we were talking about pages. He raises an interesting point in that book, apparently. He says that if a book didn't have any content in it, it would still be a book. An empty book, but it's still a book. And that's an interesting combination of something and nothing, I find. And he says you can't say the same thing about painting. Because if a painting doesn't have content, it's just a blank canvas. It's like the blank canvas that was like 4 foot by 4 foot that I had when I was in high school. What do I do with it? I didn't know how to deal with it. I needed a strategy to deal with that. You need a strategy to deal with any of these kinds of things, these spaces that need to be filled with the design. If we could approach websites in the same way and do what artists do, which when they have this dilemma of the blank canvas, the first thing they do, if they're good artists, is they'll put any mark on it whatsoever so it's not staring back at them. But it's very hard to do that with a website. How would you begin to approach building a website from the outside? Not easy, but that's what I'm actually trying to get introduced into the discussion within the Drupal community, an outside-in approach. So these are the objects of the web, the equivalent of books. These are the things that we look at, the physical things, some of which are more portable than others. And obviously information now, as I was saying, content is now all over the place. But again, just revisiting that history, this to me is a really interesting sort of infographic about where information used to be, where it used to be housed, and who had control over it. So I don't think this landscape has changed very much since, say, 1450. This is Salisbury Cathedral. Obviously, you can see something was going on there because of the fact that it's towering above everything else. So much energy and time and technological effort was put into this structure. And within the sort of context of, say, sheep farming, whatever was going on in there in terms of user experience was obviously radically different from day-to-day existence. Presumably it was supposed to have some kind of effect on your day-to-day existence. But the user experience itself was quite different from tending sheep because you're in this massive, amazing structure with a heck of a lot of very organized information being directed at you. But that's changed. Now there's competition, not only for the height of buildings, but also where you're going to get your information. There's obviously a lot more sources, and that has just continued not only with sort of just, say, capitalism, but also the information age, where now we're completely reliant and dependent on access to information. We simply have to have it. The technology behind those cathedrals, I think, is stunning. And this, in particular, the invention of the flying buttress and so on. They invented those because they had to find a way to stop these things collapsing on them, because they used to collapse. I shouldn't laugh, it's horrible. But the way they found out how to get these things to be that high was trial and error in many ways, and they did actually collapse on people. So flying buttresses, I think, are a brilliant way of getting around that and getting that height that they were trying to achieve. Now it's the opposite. Now it's tiny. We put the same kind of, probably quantitatively, a lot more attention and effort into the architecture of very small things. And we're not even talking about nanotechnology yet here. But there's other shifts too. I mean, this is a medieval multimedia user experience. This is how information and content about specific things that you needed to know would be transformed, transmitted to you. And again, coming from the sheep farm, to see something like this must have been an absolutely overwhelming experience for the participants, I'm sure. But that's changed. We've gone from belief systems to information systems. This is where we find meaning. We Google it. And that says so much about where we are right now in terms of society, culture, and individuals. So those structures, like cathedrals, did obviously have a purpose, and they had a point of focus at the front. All the activity, most of the activity, as I understand, would take place up there, and people would arrive, sit in the pews, and focus on the message. And the architecture supported that. And of course, there's the context of this universal sort of perspective on that content that is completely transmitted or transferred that idea to the audience participants. A similar structure. The audience comes in here, there's a point of focus. There's this interesting invention that's going on here, this archway, this object where everything takes place. That's the form and that's the content. The proscenium arch. It's something which I think has persisted these days. Here it is again. But now it's not in a building, it's in your living room. Or at least it came into your living room in the 50s. And now the audience is different. It would be a family, or it was supposed to be at one point, a family experience. So you see some classic black and white shots of the happy family. The men always wore ties for some reason. The women sat on the floor, and the kids were all watching with them. That seems like a long time ago, too. Now, of course, that same stuff can be experienced in a much more personal way. So the audience is basically reduced to one in terms of the physical experience. But because we do obviously need some kind of social connection, we've invented ways of maintaining some kind of sense of collective through social media, through liking and friending and commenting on things. So interesting how this point of focus is in a sense still the same, but it's changed radically. We're still looking at common things, but spatially and temporally it's diffused. And we found other ways to actually sort of produce some kind of collective experience. I find it fascinating that we do things like that. And we've become very used to looking at things through screens. Screens are really important for us in our daily lives. So here's someone looking at something through a screen. A bit hard to say what, but the fact is you can look at anything through a screen. I'm not going to say I have ever seen the Mona Lisa, but I have seen people looking at the Mona Lisa through screens, and it baffles me completely, especially when my previous Leonardo experience was the Madonna of the Rocks, and I was just in awe, and I stared at it for a long time. I can't explain this. Anyway, there it is. That's what it is. And that brings us to the concept of resolution. Let's use the Mona Lisa to explain or to go explore that. And so this bit of fuzz is what, in my impression of what she was looking at. And it's a bit hard to resolve. This, you can recognize that. But the reason you can recognize that is because of your preconceived ideas about the Mona Lisa. You could not possibly recognize that, say, 400 years ago, because not everybody knew what the Mona Lisa was, or even maybe 100 years ago. It started to become really popular around 100 years ago, I think. So the interpretation of the bits is very much a function of what you have already preloaded into your head. And then this is another one that Mona Lisa as Lego can be read by us only because of our past experiences of Lego, either directly or through children. So again, the interpretation, there is no absolute meaning there, but the interpretation of that meaning, these are all aspects of the one. But those aspects in that branch of the one are colored by the specific cultural experiences, or completely driven and informed by those cultural experiences. So this point of focus is a key concept, I think. You get inputs, you get things to be taken into consideration, and you get some point of concentration. And as a result, you get some kind of outcome, which we can call resolution. So resolution isn't just how many megapixels your camera has. It's also what is the outcome of that experience, and how does it affect you moving forward. Okay, you can't talk about the web without a cute dog or animal video, so here it is. I'd like to see that again. Okay, I want you to watch it a third time, and just see if you can notice something interesting about this. Look at what she does right now. She's sniffing the floor. Now, it looks like she knows how to close a door, because we said close a door, right? And she does it. It took her 2 tries. She knew that the door had to be shut and it had to make that clicking sound, right? It looks like she knew how to close the door. But what she knows is how to make a cookie appear on the floor, because the way we trained her was by putting the cookie up there, and when the door clicked shut, it would fall. So that's the meaning for her. It's producing cookies. Poor thing didn't get one this time. So it's against the interest of dogs to close a door. All dogs want to be on the other side of any door. And they have some kind of a horizontal gravity that attracts them across the room or the field or the yard or whatever towards humans or other dogs or whatever. But there they are. Now, here is a series of pictures I took of the same dog looking intently at the door handle. When I was getting this new door in and fixing it, I noticed she was doing that. And she knew that it had something to do with this thing up here, this shiny thing. And it's as if she was actually trying to figure out how to use it. She was trying to become a user of a door. She was trying to do something which a dog had never done before, which is open the door. And then she thinks about it a little bit. And then she looks again. I remember at one time, she would jump up once in a while and she'd sort of fumble away at it. But she, without an opposable thumb and fingers, she had a hard time with it. Never mastered that. But you can see almost she's grasping the meaning of door at that point. Here's something which you may or may not be able to grasp. If you haven't seen it before, it's going to look like a mess. And it's hard to resolve information like this. There's a wider shot of it. It's basically our brain. And this person, Ramon Icajal, was a pioneer of neuroscience. He did some amazing work a long time ago, simply documenting the structure of the brain by realizing that it was individual neurons, nerve cells. He pioneered the idea that these things were not welded together. They were actually separate entities. And they had relationships to each other, which basically opened the door to neuroscience. This is another drawing by Simone, a rendering, artist rendering of a neuron. And it has a particular kind of structure to it. It has these inputs, this point of focus called the nucleus, that then sends a signal under certain conditions out into this thing called the axon and into a new context. So it's a way of actually getting information to travel. It's being mobile from here to here. And the brain is simply full of this. Billions of these is what makes us who we are. That's our shape. Those are aspects of our oneness. The way that those things are structured and the way that the information within it is patterned. So again, reducing it down to a schematic, information comes in. If the sum of these inputs, electrical inputs, reach a certain threshold, then a pulse or multiple pulses, always the same amplitude, will pulse through the axon and get distributed into these new contexts. And guess what happens? At that point, they become the inputs for the next neuron down the chain, or neurons. And there's hundreds of these branches on these neurons. So if you take the math, if you do the math with the billions of neuron cells involved and the branches in the hundreds, you get something probably like 100 million billion possible connections. Now that's a space. That's a big space, and it's all in here. Size of a loaf of bread, a small one at that. If you look at the details, they don't connect. It comes to the end of the terminal, and then it has to transform itself into a different molecular kind of structure to send energy across to the next. Maybe it makes it, and then it goes over, and then it becomes the same input again, and it starts all over again. That's what's going on in here in the brain. Amazing, I think. And from all of that, somehow we can come up with the idea of intent and purpose and meaning. So, I want to share, when it comes to design, filling those blank canvases called applications, 4 questions that I think are really critical to that process of UX design. Always start with this first question: who is the user? And that, to me, relates to the concept of identity. The uniqueness, the things that are special, the properties of that target user. What are their objectives? What are they here for? What are they trying to accomplish? And those used to be the 2 questions I asked, but I've multiplied it to 4 now because I think these are also increasingly important. Who is the business? And what I mean by business isn't the corporate entity. I mean the organizational reason for being here. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? Why do we have a website, for example? And typically it's known as identity, or brand identity, I should say. And these days we have the concept of personal brand, so that's why it's not just corporations, it's us as well. And what's the intent? Why are you doing this website? What's it there for? Every website has an intent. I call it a business intent. Again, business in quotes. It's not just about making money. It could be information. You could be a university. You could be a non-profit organization. You could be helping people in other ways. There's an intent, and it's your business. That's why you're here. So let's map those 4 questions into this structure. Who is the user? All these inputs define who the various users might be, and those are the people, when we're doing user research, that we're trying to consider, we're taking into consideration and concentrate on. What are their objectives? Where are they actually trying to go? Where are they going with this energy? What new space are they trying to get to? And the governing factor is this, the web page itself. At any given time, it's a web page. And that is determined, the success of whether that fires or not is determined by these factors, whether or not the identity of the business, the intent of the business are reflected clearly enough that they can understand it, they get the meaning of it, and it means something to them. Yes, move forward. So it's like you're going into this kind of endless proscenium, and things keep opening up, new questions open up. We look at the next screen and we consider it in terms of business intent and what I'm trying to achieve and so on. And we just go from one step, one stage to another. That's our abstracted web experience. But it's always within this proscenium, always within this framework, and the rules of how to populate this emptiness with something apply at each level. Which brings us to the question of how do we actually pull this off? How do we make something meaningful? We need a good practical definition for meaning. And so this is the one I came up with. If it will ever come. Here it is. Continuity, one word. I like simple answers to these kinds of big questions. Continuity, with respect, broadly speaking, to this notion of identity. Something is meaningful when the identity continues. And there's different ways that we can spin this word continuity. I think it's important to do that because it's not ones and zeros. It's much more subtle. So the idea of sustainability, that's a big question for us these days. The meaning of our lives these days is going to be determined, can be asked, can be evaluated in terms of the sustainable practices that we have or not, because we're not going to get many more chances to continue as human beings on a planet. Persistence. You can apply this so many places, so many ways, but for example, math. The fact that numbers have persistent properties is very useful to mathematicians. They're not always subject to random change. They actually have persistent properties. That's what makes them meaningful. Connection, something we're all familiar with because we seemed obsessed with connecting. We're humans. We're part of a social being. We connect. And even though we're in our rooms looking at our individual screens, we connect through the social media. So connection applies to structures. Social media structures also applies to physical structures. A disconnected bridge isn't very useful, like the one that collapsed near Portland this spring. The meaning of the bridge completely ended when that truss collapsed into the river. I mean, I'm not laughing, it's a horrible thing, but that's a vivid explanation of the meaning of connection. Growth, again, another big one, obviously. But I like the idea of a tree to illustrate that. The continuous growth of a tree, in a sense, is its purpose. That's all it's here for. There was a story, I shouldn't say a story, but there was a time when I was in school, early public school, I guess, where the teacher asked us, how long does a tree live? And this young girl, Diane, she stood up, and she wasn't a very popular girl. She wasn't very healthy. She wasn't the most, sort of confident person, but she had the braveness to stand up, and she said, and I'll never forget her words, she said, forever if it's well looked after. One of the reasons I haven't forgotten that, first of all, she was right, and it was an amazing insight for someone that age, but also 2 years later she passed away. But that part of her still lives, because I will never forget that. Flow, if you think of electricity, obviously that's got a lot to do with continuity. If you break the circuit, it stops. Life, these things just keep getting bigger. Any viability of interacting components, in a sense, is life, but obviously it's more than that too. It's everything, isn't it? Ask Monty Python. The emptiness of zero and the oneness. There are aspects to continuity to all these things. So that's why I like that word. It's good for it, I think. I've been trying to find a way to visualize what all this means. And this is the best I've come up with so far. The idea of something complex as a brain with hundreds of billions of possible connections, and the idea that things start to connect, start to build up within them as we train ourselves, as we train our dogs. These patterns emerge, and it ends up producing some kind of, well, actually different points of resolution, but at some point there's some output. You do something, and that's what you sort of consider to be the final result. Of course, there isn't really. It's a continuum, but we tend to mark certain things, certain outcomes as having particular meanings. Those meanings are really these structures. What's interesting about this is that I think it's useful to think of the depth of these structures, the depth of the connection. Because if you take something which we would call superficial, we don't refer to it as deep, we refer to it as shallow. Superficial things don't have meaning. There's clues to those words, right? So there is an implied depth to meaning. And meaning can be, put it the other way, evaluated by the depth of it. I like to think of it actually as a fifth dimension. And a way to illustrate that, back when I used to practice Tai Chi, the way you learned Tai Chi was, there were 108 movements, and they were sort of physical postures in 3 dimensions, obviously. And you would learn them one after another. And then you would practice it with a bit of fluid continuity. And that would be the 4th dimension, time. You connect them all together. But if you stuck with it, and you actually practiced, and then you learned the real meaningful way to do it, what happened was the connections became more subtle. the meaning of the posture, the meaning of the movement, meaning of the poses became profoundly different, because now you're working with energy. And now you're able to actually, not that it was taught as a martial art, but it was a martial art. And so if for example, something happened, you would respond out of reflex because the meaning was in your body. So to me, it just seemed logical that that was actually a fifth dimension to what we had been learning, and that seems to apply. So the idea of a fifth dimension and shape of these connected structures is really, I think, the essence of meaning. But the one word I use to describe that shape, that fifth dimension, is character. And character is something which, in a sense, has a certain mass to it. I'll give you one illustration. In the old days of television, cameras were put on pedestals, sometimes movable, and that was the way you looked at things. At one point, Hill Street Blues happened, and the camera was given to somebody who ran around with the actors. And now all of a sudden the audience is having a different user experience because they're being jostled about visually. And that was actually a different character. That camera was more clearly a character in the piece, along with the others. So the character that we didn't notice originally was that of the earth, the grounded character, the objective view, right? And it was neutralized because we just never noticed it. But as soon as you put it in somebody's hands, the mass of that camera, that intake device changed, became the mass of a human being. And that's had a huge effect. I mean, I'm sure half the stuff you see on TV these days is shot that way because we can relate to it as human beings. It's not objective, it's subjective. So that's why character is a useful word. And all that happens in this space. There's nothing really new to this, even though neuroscience is relatively new, and the fact that we now know that so much of this stuff comes from neural patterns and so on, and certain properties of neural structures. The concept of this internal representation of the universe is old. There's an amazing quote, I'll just read it, over 1,000 years old, from the East, of course. The venerated Shakti. Shakti is a goddess. The venerated Shakti, source of energy, opens her eyes and the universe is reabsorbed in pure consciousness. She closes them and the universe is manifested within her. So the concept of it all happening, the universe is in here, is not new, it's old, it's meaningful, it's deep. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about things about meaning. Another way to explain it is the inverse. Discontinuity. So here is a wonderful picture by Chris. Are you here, Chris? Here's your picture. He wanted me to use lots of pictures, but I just used one. This is another character, and it's a character you may have seen in a movie. Have you ever seen the Blues Brothers? There's a scene in the Blues Brothers where they went driving their cars through a mall. And this is that mall. And that's why Chris posted it. It's the Dixie Mall. I think it's in Chicago. And obviously it's gone through some amazing shifts since the time it was filmed. And you might say, well, there's a big disconnect. That's not the same thing. There's no persistence there. There's no continuity. But it's more subtle than that. It's not fixed. It's not nailed in place. Of course it's shifting. It's the universe. It's changed into a different character. It has new continuities, new implications. And you can see it as soon as you look at it. And you can feel it more deeply when you consider what it was. You may have had a user experience with that scene if you watch that movie. So you have some kind of, almost like a voltage of meanings between the two to consider. Thank you, Chris. So disconnects, discontinuities, user experience disconnects, this infernal spinning cursor, the moment of confusion when a user gets to a web page and it feels like this even if they're not looking at the cursor spinning. That tells us something as well. It tells us that there were some expectations. The user arrived here for a reason. Those expectations are not being met. I'm frustrated. I want to go home. What are they? Well, again, we can use these components to evaluate that scenario. The business intents and what I call the user narratives, that's that pathway through life that we're trying to take with our energy and our objectives. So here's a few, random. Some business intents that may get expressed through some kind of website. And here's some expectations that may happen to people when they go to these websites. So when they run into a disconnect, but I had expected to book my tickets, and I'm not. I'm just looking at this baffling array of things on a screen. That, to me, is what it gets down to in the concrete specifics of user experience design. It's like, are you looking after people's expectations? Are you marrying their objectives in life with the business intent of that application? It's as simple as that, I think. And by the way, these look like user stories, but I'm not going to call them user stories. I call them user narratives. And I think if we're going to do user stories, they are useful, obviously, because they're a way to consider these real-life experiences. But I don't think we should ever start with, as a user, we're all bloody users. Let's get into something more specific. Let's get into what are the roles, what are the expectations, what's the context, as closely, with high resolution as we can get, to express that. That's why I really loved what Andrew said yesterday about the client speaking in the terms of the user, which it was baloney. That phrase itself, you know, is so blunt and so inarticulate that it allows them to do that. But if you force them to think like this, you know, what are the specific expectations that you're trying to point out here? Maybe that kind of crude expression would stop. And I think we'd be better off in terms of actually getting the websites designed and built. So don't use that term. Gets down to this. There's two worlds separated by the screen itself, the physical object. On the outside, we have site owners with the various business intents, and the site users trying to get things done in their lives, trying to continue their lives. It's part of their life story, their narrative. There's things that need to be reconciled between these parties. That's what we have to consider when we're doing a design. I would say that pretty much everything that they care about, everything that they see, everything they perceive, all the terms of reference they use is oriented towards the physical object, the screen. That's what they think the web is. It's this. There's a lot. There didn't used to be a lot of focus on UX. Now there is. You know, there's a lot of call for UX designers. It used to be more, get it to look like my printed page, but now it's UX. And I think what UX means from the outside perspective is make the things on the page dance and crossfade and move. Put JavaScript in it, and that's UX. Obviously, there's more to it than that. There's the whole back, the inside. And again, there's layers here. Wherever I put a series of dots here, what I'm referring to is some kind of interface. So there's some kind of interface that connects those. There's some kind of interface that connects these layers as well. And it's kind of still an outside-in approach here as we get further and further into this. The question is, what are we doing at these levels? And how does it relate to these people out here in the real world, the outside? Are we doing an inside-out process? I would say with Drupal we are, because a lot of what the decisions for these interfaces, for this interface, are made here in maybe not a complete vacuum, but too much of a vacuum. In other words, we have to kind of connect the outside to the inside with as many ways that we can to get information, contextual information about the meanings that have to take place out there into these inside scenarios. We need to come up with an outside-in way to build websites. Look at what happens right now. You have discussions with your client about what they want to do. You have discussions or research with your users about what they want to do. And you come up with a grand plan. You have an idea. You have a design concept. Then what do you do? Then you deal with the ones and zeros of building a website in Drupal. And by ones and zeros, what I mean is you create a node. You come up with content before you have it. You come up with some container for the content before you know what's going to be there. You come up with all of those things that the Drupal administrative interface will confront you with that are completely disconnected from that. And I think that is what's holding us back in terms of becoming a truly, truly powerful content management system. We need to have a way of transferring meanings into these contexts here. And what I refer to that is UX strategy. That's a UX strategy. Right now, within the Drupal community, as far as I can tell, there is no place to actually capture UX strategy and build it. Because in the same way that I was trying to build that big painting, I treated it as a surface covering exercise. If I'd known about hog hair or hog bristle brushes, if I'd known about certain compositional concepts, if I'd had a strategy, I might have finished that painting. And I would say a lot of our Drupal sites are like that fragmented painting for me. They're just one-offs. They're just sort of small, isolated instances of a larger problem. And we're not ever going to solve it in a truly meaningful way until we actually embed UX strategy as part of Drupal's evolution. And that, and a lot of it gets down to orienting towards site building itself, that particular role. That is all the science I have. So, thank you. I have no idea how long that took. But if there's any time for questions, I would love to hear them. And, okay, great. And also, I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen anyway, and I'm looking forward to having more discussions with people here, with the community at large, about that. So, if anybody does want to ask, Jason. For Drupal, specifically? There's a number of things which I think, well, depending on how you want to take it, but to get to a UX strategy, I would say you have to have UX design principles in place, and we don't have that. We have diverse, disconnected solutions. There's a marvelous phrase I heard that the definition of monster is an aggregation of disparate parts. Sorry, Drupal, I just called you a monster. But that's really the potential that could happen. And some people might say it's a monster. There's a huge learning curve to this. My belief is that if we can recognize, for example, that a web page is not a node is not a web page, we'll be free of that binding. We'll be free of that sort of obligatory way of building a website, which is go and build the node, decorate it, put things around it, throw it into an information architecture space. It's completely backwards. So that is the first thing I would say. There are other specific things. Redefine role. I know that's not going to happen, but I'll say it anyway. I'll say it forever. A role is not a set of permissions. A role is a set of tasks. It's a task objective. The users have roles that change all the time. Their set of permissions does not change. So a user interface has to be oriented around roles so that you can give them the things that meet their expectations at any given point. So those are some. But I did actually list a bunch of those design principles in the talk I did last fall, Drupalcamp Toronto. It's on my website. I don't blog that often, so it won't take long to find it. Around November or December, there's a video there. Aiden?
So with regards, I keep on thinking of like some of the other like commercial projects out there talk about web experience management and Drupal 8's wearing that direction you're talking about. So the first part is web experience management and whatever that's coming to mean a piece of this? And then the second question is anyone else doing a UX strategy in any project you've heard of that we can use as a model to borrow from?
Those are tough questions, Aidan. Web strategy? Web experience strategy.
Sitemore's got it, and Drupal 8 is kind of, at least in the keynote I saw, like, we're now managing your social interactions and all this stuff gets aggregated, potentially aggregated through the website. So you think that is
I don't know why, but I get the experience. I get the image of whitewater rapids shooting down the rapids and sort of trying to steer you away. That to me is what comes to mind when you say web experience management. It's like, let's hope we don't die. I really don't know what that means, so I can't answer that part of the question.
are there any other models out there in any software?
I have seen it happen. When I worked at Corel, I had the pleasure of working there at its peak, and I worked with the person that was responsible for that, who very much had a strategy. He took the status quo, the applications that are out there, and sort of refactored that, reworked it in such a way that it was an elegant interface, and it took off. I've seen it work. When I was there, I had the opportunity to work on a product called Print House. Out of the blue, I mean, from scratch, what they wanted was to capitalize on CorelDRAW's success, and so they wanted to do the power of CorelDRAW, but with the ease of use of a wizard. So I got to design that, and I got to come up with the strategy, and actually it worked really well. It sold very well. It went to in the top 10 in North America in the first year. I saw it work there. I have seen it work. I know it can happen. And I know what it takes to do it. It does take commitment. It takes the intent to make it happen. And it takes the time and the attention to user considerations and so on. It takes all of that. But I know it can happen, but unfortunately you don't see it very often. And I would like Drupal not to become like the Dixie Mall of applications. I would like it to continue. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Michael. That was great.